Our story begins in demon territory, where the main character Sakaki Rudo is in a carriage, and inside the carriage, the writer looking after it mentions that Rudo is supposed to die there. In fact, the nightmare in the main character's life started a week ago when he entered another world with other students and was labeled as a hero like them. A woman welcomed them to the world of Addis and told them that there are several races in this world that have supernatural abilities and use magic. Rudo was very confused at first, thinking he was in some kind of dream, but then he realized that they were in a normal classroom and learning. Until some earthquake started and something happened that woke them up in the Addis world. The woman said it was a real shame and she felt sorry for the heroes because they died on their home world, but thanks to the summoning ceremony that took place, they were all summoned to this more than glorious empire. She said that horrible monsters were threatening the world and so they needed her power to fight the Demon King and his armies. But the other students were still too shocked by this event that they all died in their original world and are undergoing some sort of summoning. Rudo knew exactly what it was because he had seen it many times in games, but this wasn't a dream because right now he could become one of the heroes that could confront the Demon King and defeat him. Rudo had a miserable and horrible life in his past world, but now he had a chance to become a real hero in this world, so he was excited at the prospect of completely changing his life in this new world. While he was thinking about this, one of the students named Isayama Shouta got up to talk to the girl who was introducing them to the Addis world and said that although they didn't know exactly where they had gotten to, he wanted to see if he could return them to their original world. The woman explains that she could return them to the original world, but they were dead, so nothing would ever change, and there was no point in doing that now. Isayama then thanks the girl, saying that she saved them by summoning them to that other world, and for that he decides to lend his strength to the people of that world, and moved by the students' actions, several others stand up saying that they would do the same and try to fight for that world too. This leaves Rudo a little frustrated because obviously he wasn't the protagonist of that world or that story, and meanwhile that woman from the world of Addis continued speaking, this time indicating that she would confirm their status as heroes for the time being. She asked everyone to hold out their hands so that she could see the hero status of each of them and their names, introducing us to other students besides Izwayama, who was a saint, and these were Shuji, a guardian, Minace, a master, and Mitsuki, a creator. The woman and the old man from the world of Addis are impressed because they all have very powerful abilities, and the woman goes on to say that the ability of the brave saint was an ability that belonged to the hero who built the Empire of Lux. At the same time, Rudo decided to check his own status to find out what his abilities were, and was surprised to realize that his ability was called hanging. The description said that there was no proficiency in his awakening and that it was marked by the many difficulties that his path would be fraught with. His aspirations would be painfully destroyed, and yet he must continue to strive and endure all this so that his hands can grasp the light. Seeing that Rudo was shocked when he looked at his status, the old man approached him asking what was wrong, and the protagonist showed him his status with that strange poem, which shocked the old man too, and Rudo asked what exactly it was. The old man calls the girl named Iris and also shows her his status, leaving Iris very surprised because it was actually completely blank for them, which leaves Rudo at a loss to understand why he had been able to read a poem while all the others hadn't. Iris says it was a shame, but she doesn't understand. Iris says it was a shame, but apparently Rudo wasn't a hero, which leaves the protagonist confused, and he asks what exactly she meant by his status being blank, and what would happen to him when he wasn't a hero. Izwayama approaches and tells Rudo to stop pressuring Iris like that, and all the other students stare at Rudo and gossip about him, mentioning his blank status, and that he was quite scary and a strange guy from the start, and nothing had changed since the world they had come from. Rudo feels bad because just like in his original world, people always talked badly and laughed behind his back, and with that incident involving his status, surely no one would believe him. He tries to figure out what exactly he was supposed to do when he wasn't a hero either, but Iris approaches him and says that everything was fine and apologizes for the trouble caused, but would explain things to Rudo later. Rudo replied that everything was fine and apologized because he had pushed her like that before. So Iris continued talking to the other students and heroes, saying that in order to be able to prepare to battle the Demon King, all the heroes should receive training for the next year. But they could be free to start the following week, so that they can get used to this new world, and everyone is very excited. Everyone was very excited because apparently they were even going to have a big party to celebrate, and they were curious to know what the kitchen was like in that world, and everyone was very happy except Rudo, who was isolated in his own corner. At first, Rudo thought he could create a new life in that world, but in the end he didn't belong there either. Then Iris approaches him and apologizes for leaving him out and anxious, taking him by the arm and saying that she actually had a request to make of him. She said that for the good of the Empire, she needed him to fulfill that duty, and Rudo turned away from her, asking if he could be useful, and hearing her agree, he ended up agreeing too, thinking that at least this would be better than being with the others in his class. Matsuki asks him if he's not going to the students' party later, and he agrees that he couldn't go because he didn't feel like he fit in. But he compliments Matsuki because the creator's skill she received must have been really impressive. Matsuki apologizes, which surprises the protagonist, especially since she says that she couldn't cover or help Rudo a little earlier when all the other students made fun of him. Rudo is almost dizzy hearing this and wonders if she was some kind of angel when she suddenly hands him an accessory and explains that she used her ability to be able to create that object where a magic could be activated if he broke it. Rudo is impressed that she had already learned how to use her ability and says he would be careful with the object. She asks what he intended to do now, and he replies that apparently there was something he could do even though he wasn't a hero, and since the people of that kingdom had saved his life, he thought it appropriate that he could return the favor to them. Matsuki asks if there was something she could do as well, and Rudo reminds her that she had her training to do as well, but Matsuki insists on knowing if there was really a need for him to leave like that, because she felt there was something bad about it. Rudo insists that it would be fine because his life was over in the other world anyway, so the least he could do now was try to find a new purpose in life there too. The scene then cuts to the present, when Rudo has been dumped in the middle of a forest, and the knight who took him there tells him that his job would be to die there, because with his body, they would probably end up thinking the hero was dead and he would serve as a distraction. Rudo realizes that he is being treated as something disposable, and while asking how they would know if he was really a hero or not, the man just throws a bag in his face and says goodbye to the false hero, abandoning him to his fate. Rudo feels shaken by his own situation. After all, he only wanted to make himself useful to someone. But in the end, he would be abandoned and killed right there. In his original world, or in a fantasy one, he wasn't wanted by anyone. No one could care about him. But despite this, Rudo didn't intend to give up so easily, especially since, ever since he entered the demon's territory, a loud sound kept ringing in his head, and he didn't know why until he opened his status to check what exactly was going on. He realized that his status window was quite different from the time he had only been in the castle, and furthermore, he noticed that although he was desperate about the situation, he still managed to feel quite calm. This was probably the effect of his skill called discernment, which meant that he must have been in a state of crisis. But in addition, there were other skills at work, so he ended up suddenly using a skill called intuition when he sensed the presence of an approaching monster. He was completely shocked to see that monster approaching, and the system told him that it was a bloody monk, which was the content of the test for Rudo to face it. He had to survive for 30 seconds, and the first reward would be an increase in his status, and the system hopes that Rudo can survive that short period of time. Rudo is shocked by the amount of information that came into his mind, even though he knew he needed to escape quickly before he was attacked and died, and ends up falling to the ground, narrowly dodging the monster's attack. He hears voices shouting at him to escape while wondering what he should do and if there was any way he could fight back. Then he remembers the object he ended up receiving from Mitsuki and mentally apologizes to her for not being able to keep the gift safe, throwing it at the monster and thus exploding a great magic against it in order to survive. Rudo is surprised that the monster ended up being frozen and understands that apparently the magic inside that object was freezing magic. The system congratulates him on having passed the test, and so he receives an increase in his strength and general physical abilities, and soon afterwards he receives another test, this time one in which he has to defeat that bloody monk. Rudo is surprised that he soon receives another test so quickly, and the system tells him that the first reward has been acquired, and he now has a big increase in his physical strength. And with that in mind, the protagonist clumsily punches the frozen monster, destroying it with just one blow after throwing all his rage into one movement. Rudo is surprised that he managed to defeat the monster this way, and the system confirms it when he completes the second test and receives even more of an increase in his physical abilities than before. After defeating it, he realizes that he has indeed managed to become actively stronger, but it still didn't seem quite right to him. In any case, Rudo leaves to look for food, and so ends up going through some difficulties in the forest, facing other creatures and running to the point of collapsing on the ground from exhaustion. Rudo realized that he was in a bad situation because he didn't know how many days had passed since he had gone without food and he needed to find something to eat. The system confirmed signs of exhaustion and that he was failing to use his strength abilities because he was so hungry. But the protagonist didn't want to listen to the system talking to him and just reflected that he didn't know what was hiding behind his intuition ability. But he wondered why he continued to live even though he was in so much pain. Rudo begins to wonder what he has been doing all this time in his life, especially since after everything he has only managed to waste his time. He always thought he could become anything he wanted, from a legendary hero who could save the world to an invincible hero who could turn into anything he wanted. But then that earthquake incident happened, and because of the destruction that was all around him, he started running in the middle of the night as fast as he could to get as far as possible, only to stop in that other world, and in the end he couldn't do anything really from start to finish. Suddenly, he heard sounds in the distance and realized what sounded like human figures and wondered who was running and from what and started to get up, thinking that he didn't have any time to hesitate this time. The one who was running was a girl who shouted at the monster who was running after her not to come any closer because he was just a bloody monk and couldn't attack her. But she herself wasn't confident of anything because she couldn't use magic against him and started mentally praying for help to her parents and to other girls called Zira, Nell, and Fina, begging for someone to save her. Seeing this, Rudo thought that he knew he would end up dying if he saved her, and he would die if he moved more than that, and it would all be for nothing if he died. But even though his intuition keeps talking to him, the protagonist tells her to shut up and runs towards the girl, thinking that he could never be of any use to anyone in his world and was abandoned in a place like that. But still, until the end, he wanted to try to be useful for someone's sake, even if it meant risking his life, and intuition recognized his efforts, because that's how someone with the skill of the hanged man should be. Rudo stands between the monster and the girl, throwing a punch at the monster and saying that they should die together, causing him and the monster to fall off the cliff after throwing that punch. Rudo realized that he would be dead, and it was just as those from the Empire had said, a person who wasn't a hero like him should just die. But at least he had been able to save someone's life before that, so he thought it was alright, and he could die happy because his life had served the purpose of saving them. But then a voice shouts for Ryudo to wake up at once. After all, he had saved Roronoa's life, and so she wouldn't let him die that easily. Rudo is confused because he thought he was still dreaming or something, but Roronoa put something in his mouth for him to eat, and the protagonist comments that it was something tasty, and she explains that she put her magical power inside that fruit so that he would recover quickly. Roronoa says that he has been cold for almost a whole day, and until he gets better, he should rest. After agreeing with her, Roronoa complains that he should answer not yes, but at your command when referring to the Demon King's daughter. After Rudo answers just as she wanted, Roronoa is happy and the protagonist can only think that she was a cute girl. But soon he stands up quickly in shock as he realizes that she had claimed to be the Demon King's daughter and remembers that Rudo was abandoned there because he wasn't needed for the Demon King's subjugation. But suddenly he was receiving care from the Demon King's daughter. The system then says that due to the magical power provided, his strength was being recovered, and intuition says it was unexpected that he was in contact with the ability known as Roronoa's son. Rudo realizes that Roronoa couldn't see or hear everything he heard with the system in his body, and intuition says that for some reason he couldn't interact with Roronoa because it felt like something was stopping him. Rudo mentally asks why he was so talkative and who exactly he was, and intuition replies that it was only because he was an interesting person. After all, he had been saying that he wanted to save someone's life, but in the end it was only for meaningless idealistic human purposes, practically mocking the protagonist for his sacrifice. Roronoa then introduces herself properly to Rudo, claiming to be the only and first daughter of the great demon king Roronoa Rururukia, demanding to be praised, which leaves the protagonist a little confused, and he just asks what exactly the demon king's daughter was doing there in the first place. Roronoa replies that it's a very good question because she pays close attention to his words and tells him that her birthday was the day before, and somehow there was some kind of sealing and teleportation magic among the presents she ended up receiving for her birthday. The sealing magic turned out to be nothing more than a curse that prevented her from using magic, which was pretty cruel, and Rudo is amazed that she almost ended up being killed after losing her magic. Roronoa asks what his name was and why a human was in the demon's territory. After all, that should have been her question and not his, considering that the whole territory was like a big garden to them. Rudo comments that she's been whining in corners and doing that in her own garden was a bit strange, but she tells him to shut up and just answer her question. Rudo introduced himself to her, thinking that heroes summoned from another world should normally be summoned to face the Demon King, and normally they would have been enemies, but now they seemed to be getting along, which was a bit strange. Rudo told her that she might not believe him, but he was some kind of fake hero, a human summoned from another world, which made Roronoa excited because it was the first time she had seen a person who came from another world. Rudo is surprised because Roronoa didn't actually get angry or push him away when she found out he was a hero, even though he was a demon, but she insists that heroes were the strongest humans, and that was pretty cool. The protagonist replied that he wasn't worthy of so much praise. After all, he was only a fake hero and all his companions were also summoned. But he was the only one who wasn't considered a hero and was abandoned, not even having a place to return to now. After appearing in that world, he could do nothing but struggle to survive, but in fact he had always been living like that, even before being summoned to that other fantasy world. Not as a protagonist or as a hero, but he was just always looking for something to do and a place to belong, but that place never existed. Rudo says he was just a fool who had no reason or place to live and only ended up saving Roronoa's life for his own satisfaction. But Roronoa replies that it was alright, because no matter whether he had his reasons or not, it didn't change the fact that he still decided to save her life. As the daughter of the Demon King, her life had been targeted several times, but even without knowing her face or name, he still risked his life to save her. And Ruronoa was very grateful to Rudo for this, and even though the protagonist insisted that he had nothing important, she said that he would give her a reason to live and a place to stay. Ruronoa said that the reason he was alive and had come to this world was so that he could save her, and said that he should become the steward of the Demon King's castle, living so that he could continue to protect her. Rudo ended up being affected by her words, thinking at first that she was being too confident in deciding everything on her own. But despite this, he was very happy to be so well received. That was the first time in his life that he had been needed by someone. But in the end, it was by a selfish demon princess, and he knew that if he held her hand, there would be no turning back. Ruronoa said that that was her order, so he should live by it, and Rudo ended up accepting her order, responding as she wished to be, finally allowing him to find a new reason to continue living in that world. On the way back through the Demon King's territory, Ruronoa starts counting happily, while the protagonist wonders if they really are going in the right direction. And she agrees that they are, because she's never wrong, and soon, they'll be seeing the Demon King's castle in the distance. But in fact, they end up running into a giant snake in the middle of the forest, and Rudo quickly comes over to save his new master's life, asking her if she was alright after everything. And Ruronoa replies happily and proudly that just as expected of Rudo, that was something only a quality butler handpicked by her could do. But it was the protagonist who felt he owed thanks after all. This was his second day escorting Ruronoa, and he was finally learning how to use his skills and the system to his advantage. The tests began when he encountered monsters more powerful than him or saw him for the first time in uncharted territory, and then by splitting the differences in tests, so he began. There was the survival test where one had to escape, or the final subjugation test to be able to take down the monster, before finally completing the test and receiving more experience and a considerable increase in their status. The point was that the tests were slowly making Rudo stronger and stronger, and he was already able to survive a few days without food or water, probably also being influenced by how much stronger his body had become after so long. But there were still some mysteries, and by opening his status window, the protagonist could better see the details of his level increases and his abilities getting higher and stronger. Thanks to Rurani's power, he ended up becoming much more powerful by consuming some of his magical power. But there was something known as reverse that the protagonist didn't know the origin of or what it was for, even though the status window mentioned that there were signs of reverse for gluttony, and some mistakes were made due to his lack of strength and skills that weren't yet up to the use of reverse. Rudo's intuition told him that he looked much better now, and with his current level and magical power, it might be possible to activate the reverse very soon. The protagonist asks her back if she wasn't feeling too free by saying things to him like that, and her intuition responds angrily that he was being very rude. After all, he also had a life, and it was all because they had a touching history, and now he couldn't keep silent as long as before. Rudo told her to stop making fun of him like that, because it was the first time she had received such kindness after arriving in that world, and she didn't want anyone laughing at her memories with Ruronoa. His intuition tells him that it was very heartless of him to say that when there was still that girl from his homeland who had given him the pendant a while before and who had used magic to save his life. The protagonist is confused and asks what exactly he meant by that, but suddenly his intuition is completely silent. Until his intuition asks him if he remembers how he defeated the bloody monk for the first time, and Rudo starts to answer until he finally realizes that he doesn't remember how he did it in the first place. He just remembers that something started to freeze, but he couldn't remember it in that much detail and wondered if it was because he was getting exhausted, but his intuition seemed to be worried about it. Ruronoa then catches Rudo's eye and points to what looked like black and purple smoke coming from the distance, and she says that that was the smoke signal from her knights, and it looked like they were searching even in that direction. Ruronoa held Rudo back and told him that they could go on now and that they should run towards the smoke because she was sure they would be able to find Zero when they met up with the knights too. Rudo asked who Zero was, and Ruronoa replied that she was a dear friend of his. She then holds onto Rudo as he starts to run, laughing because he was running so fast and praising him for being so amazing, and he asks her to hold on tight so he doesn't end up falling. Rudo begins to consider that Ruronoa was wanting to meet the knights, but wonders if they would really accept a human among them, and wouldn't it be strange if they all just wanted him dead on sight. Ruronoa said that when they reached the Demon King's castle, he would introduce him to his father, and after that to Nell and Zira as well. After all, he was their benefactor now, so he should lift his chest proudly and everything would be fine because he could handle the rest of things very well. Rudo realizes that being around her, his worries were all quickly dispelled, and now he could finally find a place where he could belong. Suddenly, he is ordered to jump, and Rudo now ends up doing it on impulse, and it's all because they end up facing a large monstrous wolf. Ruronoa is shocked that what appeared in front of them was a bloodthirsty dirty wolf, and wonders why there was one of those monsters in a place like that, and says that they should start running away immediately. But the protagonist replies that it seemed a little too late to consider fleeing at this point, and it was clear to anyone that they would be killed if they started running now. The system confirms that they have come into contact with a hostile enemy, and the new test for Rudo begins to be revealed, where he must defeat the hostile enemy, known as the Great Wolf of Death Mountain, and this was a test based on the premise of using reverse, and the test and reward would change according to the proportions of his reverse. Rudo put Roronoa down and asked her to get away from him as quickly as possible and hide, still trying to understand what all those new terms the system was introducing him to were all about. Then Intuition said that now was the time to use her card in hand, and explained that the requirement for activating reverse was to match their level and magical power so that they could trigger it through their strong emotions. Rudo asks what exactly she meant by strong emotions, and Intuition replies that the one that failed to activate a while before was gluttony. But he should try to activate it once more, but talking was easier than doing, especially so suddenly. The wolf takes advantage of Rudo's hesitation and scratches him, making him complain because he was too fast and his intuition wasn't able to keep up with his opponent's movements. Roronoa realizes that Rudo was having a hard time facing the big wolf, but he insists that she should keep running. But she refuses and draws the wolf's attention. But Rudo immediately becomes concerned for Roronoa's life and shouts at the wolf not to touch her, and Intuition mentions that the reverse was caused by humanity's original sin and asks what Rudo's decision would be now. The protagonist told his intuition to shut up because he didn't care about strong emotions or original sins, because as long as he could get the power to protect Roronoa, the power to be able to defeat that monster and keep his life intact, he would use it no matter what, and just screamed at his intuition to give him that power right away. The system detects the sin of greed and uses the reverse to stabilize his power, thus beginning the use of his ability. Intuition says that the reverse referred to the reverse position of the tarot cards and awakened the hidden powers of arcana, and the meaning of the hanged man in the reverse position was a person who lost to his worldly desires. Rudo begins to suffer from a great change of appearance as he transforms with a reverse, beginning a monologue from a poem about how the treasures placed in the heavens and on earth by his tender would always have insects crawling under their rust to destroy them, but he would drill into them and steal them all the same. He was the plunderer who collected all the riches, confiscated all the skills, and gathered all the power. He was the Black Death Mask of Greed, known as Mavelisha. The Great Wolf sets out to attack the protagonist when he sees the transformation, but Rudo restrains him using the chains of his genius ability. The system says that the reversal of greed has been completed and thus notifies him of the renewal of the original content of the test, now requiring him to take and leave the Great Wolf totally without any kind of power. The reward would be a considerable increase in his strength, but in addition, he would also receive eternal dominion over the Great Wolf. With the transformation, Roronoa asks if he really was Rudo, and what exactly happened with that explosion of power and his new form, and the protagonist laughs, replying that he didn't really understand what happened either, but in any case, they needed to get to grips with that great wolf that he had managed to bind with his chains. Opening his status window, Rudo is surprised that his current power has increased much more than before, and that it was full of new abilities related to sins, the maiming of demons, and several others that caught his eye. Rudo realizes that he could only use his reverse power for another 5 minutes, and apparently there were still several other crazy abilities that he hadn't had time to check out and find out what they did. Rudo thinks that the test should make him leave his opponent without any power, but genius wasn't a magic he could use and wonders what else could be used in that regard. Roronoa says that that wolf was a bit strange because he could feel a kind of magical influence around him, and it was probably some kind of curse that was affecting him. Rudo realizes that, on closer inspection, it looked like the big wolf was in a lot of pain, so the protagonist approaches it using his goblin ability, which he uses to absorb his enemy's power, stamina, and agility, as well as curses and abnormal statuses that can be converted into physical strength. Thus, his goblin ability began to work on the great wolf's body, absorbing and transforming the curse on its body into physical strength. The system confirms that the great wolf's status power has been properly converted, and the test also comes to an end, and Rudo receives his rewards, confirming his target's submission and also acquiring dominance over the great wolf. Rudo is relieved that he was able to complete the test on time, even though he had a headache, and Roronoa asks if he's alright, and Rudo agrees that he is, but they needed to get it over with while he still had some strength left in his body. The system asked if he wished to exercise the domination skill, and his intuition began to praise Rudo because he was able to fulfill the test properly, and he had a great talent for continuing to use his powers. She explains that basically the domination ability would turn the great wolf into his companion, and Rudo begins to consider the possibility of doing so. When he touches the big wolf, Rudo rejects the idea because his hands are now very full, and he can't be bothered to look after and train a big animal like him now. But Rudo said he could come and see him again if somehow the big wolf could shrink in size. Intuition tells him that it was a bit sad to abandon him like that, and he couldn't be responsible for what might happen in the future. Finally, Rudo's transformation breaks down, and he falls into the arms of Roronoa, who holds him and thanks him for saving her life, praising him for trying so hard for her. She says that he was indispensable to her and would certainly make everyone recognize him for his efforts. The scene cuts to the arrival at the Demon King's castle, as the protagonist had fainted after all his efforts and ended up waking up in an unfamiliar bed, wondering where he was and what had happened. Suddenly, a girl appears next to him saying that at last he had managed to wake up, and she introduces herself as Fina, the head maid of the Demon King's castle, and says she is available to help him adjust to his new stay. Fina told him that it had been 2 weeks since Rudo had been sent to the Demon King's mansion, and that they had been taking care of his injuries ever since, as he had arrived badly wounded at Roronoa's side. Rudo is surprised to have woken up inside the Demon King's castle and thanks Fina for taking care of his injuries. The maid apologizes for waking him up so suddenly while she was looking after him, but asks him to change his clothes as well. Rudo is confused by the amount of information he has received so suddenly, but the maid tells him that he should put on his new clothes and present himself to the Demon King who has been waiting to see him. Rudo put on his butler's clothes, reflecting on the tense situation he found himself in. After all, he would have to meet the Demon King, Roronoa's father, and also the great enemy of this world in person. And he thought that the situation would be very uncomfortable considering that if the Demon King hadn't already killed him when he first arrived at the mansion, the chances of that happening now were also high. Rudo asked to be excused and entered the room where the Demon King was waiting for him. And the Demon King said he could come in and formally introduced himself to him, laughing so that the protagonist wouldn't get so tense because he wasn't intending to eek him or anything, and invited him to sit with him in the meeting room. Rudo decides to do as the Demon King asks, and the Demon King introduces himself as Alto de Ruarukia, but he could just call him Alto, looking very happy to meet Rudo. The protagonist is surprised that Alto seems quite different from what he first imagined the Demon King to be, and Alto starts talking about how he heard about his situation from his daughter Ruru, and thanks him for saving his daughter's life. The Demon King goes on to explain that he couldn't do it himself because there was his position as the great Demon King, and it would be a situation of pity and great trouble, which makes the protagonist nervous, and he asks Alto to raise his head because he was practically bowing to him for saving his daughter's life. Alto replied that he would find a way to reward Rudo appropriately at a later date and promised that he would do so soon, and today he had called him into the room so that they could discuss another matter. First of all, Alto starts talking about Rudo's ability, as he has heard that he should be considered the weakest person in the Lux Empire, and then the protagonist replies that apparently other people weren't able to see something that he could, and thus opens his status window. The Demon King looks at the status window and comments that he himself wasn't able to see anything and asks what his current ability was, and Rudo replies that it was called hanging. Alto is shocked that he has an arcane ability and asks who saw his status before that, and Rudo replies that the first person to see his status was an old man from the Empire with an employee called Iris. The Demon King replies that his suspicions were correct then, because it wasn't that Ryudo's statuses couldn't be seen by others, but that she was deliberately hidden on purpose. The protagonist asks what he meant by that, and Alto explains that a high-level skill was used to be able to hide his statuses, and the only one capable of doing something like that would be the old man who had seen his status first before everyone else, known as the Hermit. Rudo asks Alto to tell him more about the Arcana, and Alto explains that the Arcana was an existence full of all kinds of mysteries, all of which were powerful abilities. What was known about the Arcana was that only 21 people could possess them, and there were even a few such people hidden within the territory of the Demon King's kingdom. The old man who managed to hide Rudo's status was one of the Arcana users, as the Hermit specialized in the art of concealment, and whether it was himself or others, he was able to hide his form, his status, and even his memories. Rudo asks why he would have hidden his statuses, and Alto tells him that the only possibility he can think of to answer this is that he didn't want the Empire to use Rudo's arcane ability. Alto says that despite this action would only be disadvantageous for the Empire, but even so, the Hermit was not known as a human of the Empire, as his ancestry and background are unknown. He could only assume that they told Rudo that he was one of the heroes summoned by the Empire, and probably that they were supposed to defeat the demon race that controlled the monsters and were the world's greatest enemies, and the protagonist can't help but be surprised that it was all true. The Demon King tells him that it was all just a big manipulation of the human race, because in fact other races had good relations with the demon race, and the ferocity of the monsters had nothing to do with it, and the human race was a great enemy of the demon race. Rudo comments that now that the Demon King has mentioned it, the monsters certainly wouldn't have attacked Roronoa if they really were controlled by the demons to begin with, and the Demon King agrees because he seemed to understand things very well now. Alto mentions that the heroes summoned from another world were manipulated into believing that the demons were the great evil and were out to destroy the world and the Empire, being isolated inside the castle and trained to be nothing more than soldiers with the sole purpose of exterminating the demons. Rudo wonders why the Empire would do something like this, and Alto replies that it was because the Light Empire was the closest place to the demon realm within the human world, and they had their eye on the lands rich in magical powers and resources that were in their lands and wanted to take them over. The protagonist complains that the humans were making very dirty approaches by taking advantage of people who had been summoned from another world just for the hell of it, and Alto comments that if Rudo shows them his new power, he could certainly be accepted again by the Empire and the human kingdom if he returns. Even so, Ruranoa had told his father that he wanted him to become his steward permanently, so he wanted to respect his opinion and decision, but the protagonist replied that he just wanted the Empire to go to shit, and that was his decision. This makes the Demon King laugh and reply that he's spoken very well now. After all, Alto was worried when his daughter came running begging for it every day since Rudo arrived at the castle, and in the end, the Demon King was relieved that his daughter's new butler was actually an interesting guy. Rudo thanks him for the compliment and comments that hiring him so suddenly was complicated, and wonders if someone in the castle won't end up complaining about his decision in the end. But Alto tells him that Ruru has actually been taking care of all this in the meantime, even though it's been by force, which leaves the protagonist a little confused, but the Demon King concludes by saying that he'll understand soon enough and says goodbye, wishing Rudo good luck. The protagonist starts walking around the kingdom and ends up being drawn towards a kind of arena that was full of people gathered together and making a lot of noise, and he soon runs into Ruru, who runs towards him very happy to see his butler awake and safe. Ruru asked him if his body was alright and if nothing was hurting, commenting that she really wanted to stay by his side and watch him recover during that time. But Rudo assured her that he was fine, even when Ruru went on to say that she had been worried enough to keep thinking about her butler's state of health even while she was at work. Until two other people approached mentioning that Rudo and Ruru were really close, and Ruru started to want to introduce them. But one of the demons interrupted her, saying that she had heard a lot about Ruru from Rudo and introduced herself as Ermal, a mage and Ruru's cousin. And Ruru finishes by introducing the other girl, who was the captain of the knights, Zira, who despite the protagonist trying to greet her, only received a cold look in her direction. Zira approaches him and asks if he really intends to become a servant in that castle with that body, and on top of that, in a daring position as Rura's butler, visibly angry because no matter what Rura's wishes were, she never wanted to recognize him as someone worthy of serving the king's daughter. Rura butted in and asked Zira to stop it. After all, he had said several times before that Rudo was his benefactor, but Zira was still complaining about a human working in the demon castle like that. The protagonist thought that just as he had imagined, he couldn't be accepted so easily by the people there. Ruru said that there was enough to complain about and told him that it was precisely for this reason that he had built the arena, because in order for everyone to know whether or not Rudo was worthy of being his butler, he would need to prove it to everyone who was watching him there and now. Then Zira said that Rudo would need to face one of her elite knights who was under the command of her squadron, and only then would she be able to recognize him if he was able to beat a man she had trained fairly and with dignity. The protagonist ended up accepting because he didn't have much to choose from in that situation, especially when Ruru said that her orders should now be very clear even without him having to tell her, and Rudo said he would do as she commanded. The knight laughs because he should have the courage to challenge him empty-handed and shouldn't try to underestimate him, but the protagonist replies that he's never used a weapon before and it was just part of his habit. So the battle between them begins and the knight charges at Rudo, firing an attack at Rudo's side just to scare him a little. Watching the battle, Ermal wonders if this wasn't too much for Rudo after all. Even if there was only one weapon being used, it must have been a bit too deadly. Zira replies that it was part of the intimidation, and if Rudo wasn't even capable of responding to this kind of attack, leaving Ruru in his hands would be a great outrage. The knight asks why he doesn't at least try to dodge his blows, and suggests that Rudo was even too upset to move after seeing his attack that destroyed the ground. But the protagonist replies that he was only testing his opponent and mocks that there was no need to dodge in the first place, which makes the knight angry and he goes after Rudo for good. But to the knight's surprise, the protagonist quickly dodged and appeared behind him in the blink of an eye, striking back with several kicks at his opponent. The knight falls to the ground, leaving everyone in the audience shocked to the point where they can't even say anything. Zira thought that Rudo's moves looked pretty amateurish, but he still had absurd physical strength, and with Ruru hoping that she would finish the fight soon, Zira sighed and stepped forward, handing the victory of the battle to Rudo. The protagonist thinks he's relieved because at least he managed to raise his level early enough not to have to worry about that duel, and in the end, the tests in the forest weren't entirely in vain. Ruru approaches Rudo and says that now there should be no more doubts because with this, they could throw a welcome party for their new butler now that he has proved his abilities in front of everyone. Ruru told the protagonist to follow, but Rudo asked her to wait, kneeling down in front of her and saying that it was a great pleasure to be able to be by her side, Princess Ruranoa Rururukia, and from then on, he would serve her for all eternity. Hey, Manga Akita's here. I hope you enjoyed this story and want to see the next part. In that case, write in the comments the secret word, curse. That way I'll know you've watched this video to the end. That's all for now. See you later, and bye-bye.